Tuesday. God willing, the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt and we won't have a problem. But if Chas v'Shalom we're not Zocha, so Tuesday morning we're going to be fasting. The good news is it is the shortest fast of the year because it's the shortest day of the year, or one of the shortest days of the year, and it is the fast of Asara B'Teves. So let me just review some simple things. There are 4 fast days in the Jewish calendar that commemorate events that are connected to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. There is the 10th of Teves, there is the 17th of Tammuz, there is the 9th of Av, and then there is the fast of Gedalia, that is the day after Rosh Hashanah. The Yom Kippur fast has nothing to do with the Beis HaMikdash, that's in the Torah, but these other fast days are rabbinic enactments, and they are connected to events involving the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Now let's go over the chronological order of these particular events. On the 10th of Teves, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylonia, had his army begin a siege around Jerusalem. Now the temple was not destroyed for another 3 years, but the beginning of the siege was on the 10th of Teves. Now, then the next event is in Tammuz. Now this is going to be a little confusing. On the 9th of Tammuz, meaning more than 2 years later, almost 3 years later, on the 9th of Tammuz, Nebuchadnezzar's army broke through the wall of Yerushalayim and got control of the city on the 9th of Tammuz. I'll get to the 17th in a moment. And on the 9th of Av, 1 month later, they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. Right? So the sequence of events vis-a-vis the first temple, and again, it's not the 17th of Tammuz. 17th of Tammuz is not relevant for the first temple, was Asara B'Teves, the beginning of a siege. The 9th of Tammuz, the city was broken into, two plus years later, and on the 9th of Av, the temple was destroyed. Now, the fast of Gedalia is the latest of all of these things. After the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and a large percentage of the population was either murdered or exiled, there was a small population of Jews that were allowed to remain in Eretz Yisrael. And the purpose was to cultivate the vineyards and the fields so Nebuchadnezzar could get tribute. So a small group of people were allowed to remain to kind of be tenant farmers. And over this small group of people, there was a governor who was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, but the governor was a righteous person. He was Gedalia ben Achikam. And as long as Gedalia was governor, there was still kind of a hope that maybe God will cancel, maybe God will reverse the destruction of the temple and bring the Jewish people back, and maybe Gedalia's Mashiach. There's still that Jewish presence with kind of a melech figure. What happened was that Gedalia had enemies, Jewish enemies. Gedalia had people who were jealous of him. And there was a fellow, Yishmael ben Nesanya, who's a Jew, who actually engineered Gedalia's assassination. And the Gemara explains, very interestingly enough, that Gedalia was warned that there's somebody who's coming to kill you. The person asked for a meeting, etc., and he was ambushed. Gedalia was ambushed at the meeting. But Gedalia was such a tzaddik, he says, I don't accept Lashon Hara about other Jews. And the Gemara says he made a big mistake. If somebody gives you credible information that somebody wants to kill you, you don't say, I don't listen to Lashon Hara. You take steps that you need to do to be protected. So Gedalia was killed, according to many, many Meforshim, on Rosh Hashanah itself, on Rosh Hashanah. But since Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Tov, and we don't fast on a Yom Tov, so we push it off to the first available day, and the first available day happens to be the day after Rosh Hashanah, the 3rd of Tishrei. Okay, so the order of the events chronologically is Asara B'Teves, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, Tzom Gedalia. Tzom Gedalia was only 2 months after the Churban Beis, less than 2 months after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Right? The Churban Beis HaMikdash is the 9th of Av. Gedalia was killed the 3rd of, the 1st or the 2nd of Tishrei. So how much time do you have? 9th of Av, next month is 9th of Elul, and 3rd of Tishrei is less than a month away. So you have to understand that Gedaliah's assassination wasn't stam the tragedy of a righteous person being killed. I mean, unfortunately, we've had many examples of righteous people being killed. But rather, Tzom Gedaliah was part and parcel of the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, in which it was now understood that the Golus was not going to be reversed very quickly. There would be 70 years of Golus until the second temple was built. Now, so the question becomes this. So based on what I've described, why is there a fast on the 17th of Tammuz? The fast ought to be on the 9th of Tammuz, because it was the 9th of Tammuz that the enemies, that Babylonians, broke through the city. So the Gemara explains, you're right, but if we go to the second temple, which is under Roman domination, the Romans broke through Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, and we don't want to have a fast both on the 9th and on the 17th. That would be too difficult. So if we're only going to pick one, we pick the second. So here is something, though, that's a little odd to me, because there seems to be a little bit of an inconsistency. When it comes to the first temple, we fast on the day the siege began, but we don't fast on the days that the Babylonians broke through the city, which was the 9th of Tammuz. When it comes to the second temple, we commemorate the day that the Romans broke through the wall, but we don't commemorate the day that they began their siege. I don't even know what day that is. So I'm not sure. You're picking out significant events, and your three significant events are: when did the siege begin? When was the wall breached? When was the temple destroyed? Now, the temple being destroyed is the same for both the first temple and the second temple. It's, of course, the 9th of Av. But the 10th of Teves only commemorates the beginning of the siege for the first temple, not the second temple. In fact, I don't even know the day that the Romans began the siege of Jerusalem. And the 17th of Tammuz only commemorates the breaching of the wall for the second temple and not the first, because we know the first was the 9th of Tammuz. So I don't have any answer. I don't have any teretz to even say about that. But it's just, as I'm talking, it's just a little bit of an anomaly that hits me in that sense. So there's another connection, though, to all of these things, and that is these events that are connected to the Chorban Beis HaMikdash are rooted in earlier tragedies that have befallen us. So, for example, now this is not true for Tzom Gedaliah per se. As far as I know, there's nothing earlier in Tzom Gedaliah. But for the 10th of Teves, for the 17th of Tammuz, and for the 9th of Av, there are earlier tragedies that made these days ominous days for the future. The 17th of Tammuz was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down. It's 40 days from Shavuos. We heard the 10 Commandments on Shavuos. Moshe went to Har Sinai for 40 days. He comes down on the 40th day, which if you make a cheshbon is the 17th of Tammuz. And the Jewish people are worshiping the golden calf. And Moshe Rabbeinu smashes the luchos. And Hashem says he wants to destroy the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu has to pray and do tshuva and go up and down Har Sinai, two different extra periods of 40 days. So the primeval tragedy of the 17th of Tammuz was the luchos were smashed as a result of the Chet HaEgel. Now, the 9th of Av also has a primeval origin, and that primeval origin is the sin of the spies. The spies went on a mission for 40 days, and they came back on the 8th of Av, if you count the 40 days, and they gave their negative report, and they said that the inhabitants of Canaan are giants, and they're so powerful and strong, and we have no way of defeating them, and all we're going to do is die, we're going to go and be killed. And that night, right, the night after the 8th of Av, the night of Tisha B'Av, everybody cried, and they said, there's no hope. And the Medrash says, God decreed, You have cried for no reason. You have cried for naught this night. This night will be the night of eternal crying, mourning, wailing, the 9th of Av. So just as the 17th of Tammuz is rooted in the Chet HaEgel, Tisha B'Av is rooted in the Chet of the Meraglim. So I had mentioned in another shir, what is Asara B'Teves rooted in, so to speak? In other words, Chazal don't tell us. Chazal do not connect Tzom Gedalia to an earlier tragedy, nor do they connect Asara B'Teves to an earlier tragedy. They only make the connection for the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. But I saw a certain sefer, Rav Shlomo Fisher, Rav Shlomo Fisher, how should I describe him? He was just Nifter a few months ago. He is the greatest Gaon that you've never heard of. He was not well known at all among average people. I mean, Talmidei Chachamim knew him because he was very tzanua, very, very quiet, very private. He was never involved in any type of political statement. He was a zaken. He was well over into his 90s, but he was an absolutely phenomenal Gaon in not only Babli, Yerushalmi, Shas, but also Kabbalah, and also science, and also philosophy, and all of the Chachmas, a true, true treasure in Yerushalayim, who knew Kol HaTorah Kula. In fact, because he was so bright, so broad-minded, so knowledgeable about so many areas, that itself was a source of controversy. Some of the more traditional Gedolim sometimes thought he was exploring too many areas, but he was kind of untouchable, meaning to say when you have somebody on that particular madrega, like whatever he does is what he does, you don't fool around with him, because he would, in all likelihood, he was probably much greater than anybody who would criticize him, so there was nothing that could be said. But be this way, Shlomo Fisher posits, although he doesn't have such a strong proof, that Mechiras Yosef occurred on the 10th of Teves. So if you accept it, and again, I do want to emphasize that this identification is not explicit in Chazal, so it's not as ironclad as the other two identifications. But it's interesting that if you accept his pshat, the 3 fast days are rooted in what you might call primeval sin. That Asara B'Teves is rooted in Mechiras Yosef. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is rooted in the Chet HaEgel. And Tisha B'Av is rooted in the Chet HaMeraglim. Now, these primeval sins are actually very instructive. I call them primeval because they are, in a sense, root sins. In other words, just like cancer starts with just a small cell growing amok, so to speak, and eventually it spreads and spreads and spreads, so too, certain root averos eventually spread till they become a virtual cancer, destroying the organism of Am Yisrael and its relationship to God. And therefore, in a sense, Mechiras Yosef, Egel, and Meraglim are those root averos here. Mechiras Yosef, of course, is an exemplar of sinas chinam, hatred, jealousy, animosity between Jews. And that we know eventually turns into a cancer of Churban, because we are told that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam. And sinas chinam is rooted in Mechiras Yosef. The second root avera is avodah zarah, when you reject worship of God and you substitute other idols for God. Now, by the way, let me just point out, idolatry itself can take many forms. There is the idolatry of bowing down to a statue, and there's the idolatry of worshiping money, power, politics, or whatever it is. So idolatry, people say, we don't have avodah zarah today. In some places we actually do. But the fact that, the average person, even if he's not religious, doesn't bow down to a statue, okay, that's fine. But avodah zarah can take many, many protean forms. You can worship money. You can worship yourself. When you live a life that's devoted to your own hedonism, that's avodah zarah too. You happen to be the one that's the idol. Looking after number one, you define yourself as number one. So the Egel represents Avodah Zarah, rebellion against God. And finally, the Meraglim represents not appreciating Eretz Yisrael, looking at Eretz Yisrael as a bad place, as a negative place. So it's interesting that in a sense, the Beis HaMikdash's destruction is rooted in these three types of rebellions. Sinat Chinam, not appreciating your fellow Jew. Avodah Zarah, not worshiping God, trying to look for substitutes to God. And the third one is, well, actually it's multifaceted, but the Meraglim is both not appreciating Eretz Yisrael and not trusting that Hashem will give you the resources to meet the challenges that you have. Right? So these are the roots of these particular sins. Now again, I'm going to give you another, I apologize, I sometimes have questions without answers. I raised the question before that how come the beginning of the siege we only commemorate for the first temple, but the breaking of the wall we only commemorate the second temple and we don't commemorate the other event? I'm now going to give you another kasha that's interesting. Everybody knows the well-known Gemara in Maseches Yuma. I've mentioned it many times and I'm sure you've heard it many times. Maybe you even learned it, that there's a difference between why the first temple was destroyed and why the second temple was destroyed. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because the Jewish people were guilty of the worst Averos, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Araya, sexual immorality, Shvichas Damim, murder, the worst Averos. But the second Beis HaMikdash that was destroyed by the Romans, the Jews were largely from. They kept the mitzvos, they learned Torah. Why was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? So the answer is because of Sinat Chinam, because of hatred, polarization. By the way, this was no joke. Josephus, who was a Jew, but again, he's a little controversial. He went over to the Romans, but he wrote histories of the Jewish people that are considered to be reliable, and he wrote them in largely a positive light. He describes Sinas Chinam in such a vivid way that there were rival Jewish sects who were vying for control of Yerushalayim to fight the Romans. So these were actually battles between Jews in Yerushalayim. And he describes a scene in the Beis HaMikdash where there were two rival Jewish groups who were shooting arrows to each other, one side of the other. And the Kohanim, who were bringing korbanos still, they were ducking under the arrows to try to bring the korbanos of the Beis HaMikdash. So this Sinas Chinam was not just emotional Sinas Chinam. It was literally life and death. And he quotes Titus. Now, I'm going to take this with a grain of salt, although I think, again, Titus was the actual general who destroyed or ordered the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Titus, Titos, and Titos eventually became emperor. But at the time of the destruction of the temple, he was the general in Jerusalem. His father, Vespasian, had been a general who became emperor, and Titos succeeded Aspasiones, which is Vespasian. Now, Josephus had a very strange relationship with Titus. Let me just explain this a little bit, because it's very, very odd. Josephus, whose name is Yosef ben Matisyo, not the Chanukah Matisyo, he's much later, but Yosef ben Matisyo was a Kohen, and he was actually the leader of a Jewish army. But he surrendered to the Romans after his army committed suicide. There was a suicide pact, which again is not halakhically proper. Josephus mysteriously was the last survivor. Somehow he survived, which means he didn't want to participate in this. And he surrendered to the Romans. And for the rest of the war against the Jews, Rome against the Jews, Josephus lived in Rome under the protection of Vespasian, the direct protection of Vespasian. And that's where he wrote his Jewish histories. Now, you can understand why Josephus, even from a secular perspective, is a very controversial guy. Some look at him as a traitor, as a Russia, as a Benedict Arnold, if you remember Benedict Arnold from the American Revolution. What type of guy just surrenders to the enemy and kind of becomes a good buddy with the emperor? On the other hand, Josephus maintained that from his position, he was able to perhaps describe to the emperor and to the generals that the Jewish people as a whole did not want to rebel, which actually is true, and there were just some fanatical people who were trying to do it, and Josephus says he was doing Am Yisrael the service by painting them in a correct light. Now, in truth, as strange as it is, Josephus's position was very consistent with the view of our Chachamim. Our Chazal were not in favor of the Jewish people entering into an armed revolt against Rome. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai tried to stop it. So Josephus's idea that we shouldn't fight and the whole war is not really supported by Am Yisrael, but they're just some crazy people who want to make war, which is what Josephus writes, is exactly what the Gemara in Gittin says. These are called Biryonim. The war party are called Biryonim. The word Biryonim is an Aramaic word for wild hooligans. That's how our Chazal called them. So the funny thing is, from a nationalistic perspective, you can look at Josephus and say, what a bad guy, what a wretch, traitor. But from the perspective of Chazal, he was not all wrong. But given the circumstances that he was literally living in one of Vespasian's palaces, he was living there, mamish, one could understand that he could not afford to be too negative about the Romans. He tried to portray the Jews in a good light, indeed, but he also tried to portray the Romans in a good light, because, what's he going to say? So he writes that Titus did not really want to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Titus is the general in Rome. Titus would have let the Beis HaMikdash stand, but one of his soldiers started throwing torches around and, it got into a fire that was uncontrollable. That probably is a sheker. But then he quotes something else from Titus, which I'm afraid to say might have been true. At one point, Titus is surveying what's going on with the Jews in Jerusalem. And Titus is saying, maybe I don't have to destroy this city at all. If I just wait long enough, they'll destroy it themselves. Now, I don't know if Titus said it or didn't say it or Josephus made it up, but it accurately expresses the idea of sinas chinam. So in a sense, the statement rings with a certain authenticity, even though I could not say if Titus actually said it. Fascinating thing. So here is my question. My question is this. So Chazal identified that the sins of the first temple are avodah zarah, gilei arayah, shavichas damim, but the big sin of the second temple was sinas chinam. Now, sinas chinam, as I said before, is rooted in Mechiras Yosef. Which fast comes out of Mechiras Yosef? The 10th of Teves. Now here's my problem. The 10th of Teves is not connected to the second Beis HaMikdash. It's only connected to the first Beis HaMikdash. So isn't it odd that the fast day that is devoted only to the first Beis HaMikdash is rooted in the Aveira of Mechiras Yosef, that is sinas chinam, that's connected to the second Beis HaMikdash? In other words, the matchup is wrong. It's like you're matching up the wrong wires, so to speak. The wires are crossing. Meaning, again, be sure you understand the chronology. There is no event that I'm aware of that connects the 10th of Teves to the second Beis HaMikdash. The 10th of Teves is only connected to the first Beis HaMikdash. The 17th of Tammuz is only connected to the second Beis HaMikdash. That's the day the Romans broke through the city. It is not connected to the first Beis HaMikdash, and because the first Beis HaMikdash, the date that the Romans broke through was the 9th of Tammuz. Tisha B'Av is the one fast day that's connected to both, and Tzom Gedalia also is only connected to the first Beis HaMikdash, right? So Asara B'Teves and Tzom Gedalia are only the first. Shiva Zar B'Tammuz is only the second. Tisha B'Av is both. So, again, I'm just throwing out a question. I don't have an answer to this question exactly. And that is that if Rav Shlomo Fisher is telling us that the primeval sin that generated the tragedy of Asara B'Teves was Mechiras Yosef, it's a little odd, is it not, that the Aveira of Mechiras Yosef, which is sinas chinam, is connected to the Chorban Bayis Rishon, which is because of Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shvichas Damim. So that's something to think about. Yeah.
One could make the argument that murder for sure is rooted in sinas chinam. Adultery, he shouldn't have that woman, I should, is sinas chinam. And idol worship, I'm not going to that shul, I worship.
Yeah. So what one could say, no, you're correct. One could say that really sinas chinam is kind of the root of everything. So it's also the root of avodah zarah, shvichas damim. That's possible, again. But then it wouldn't be distinctively sinas chinam. It would take the configurations of avodah zarah, gilei raya, shvichas damim. Okay. So these are something to think about. Now, there's a very, very interesting chiddush that Rav Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, brings in the name of Rav David Avudraham, who was a Rishon in Spain, who wrote about tefillah. The Avudraham is one of the great authorities on tefillah and minhagim of tefillah and the like. We know that if one of the fast days falls out on Shabbos, if even the 9th of Av falls out on Shabbos, Tzom Gedalia falls out on Shabbos, Shivas Arba Tammuz, we do not fast on Shabbos. You're not allowed to fast on Shabbos, so the fast is pushed off for the next day. The only exception is Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a different thing. Yom Kippur is called the Shabbos of Shabbases. Yom Kippur is in the Torah. The other fast days, even the 9th of Av, is a rabbinic fast. It is not a Torah fast. But Yom Kippur, of course, is Doraisa. And Yom Kippur, we do fast on Shabbos. That much is true. But every other fast, we don't. Now, Asara B'Teves can never fall out on Shabbos. That's simply a calendrical reality that based on when, because you understand that the Jewish calendar is going to be based on the days of Rosh Hashanah, meaning once you know when Rosh Hashanah is, that's how you figure out all the other holidays. Now, Rosh Hashanah, there are 3 days of the week that the first day of Rosh Hashanah can never fall in the Jewish calendar. And this is a very famous acronym. Lo Adu Rosh. Adu is Aleph, Dalet, Vav. Aleph is Sunday. Dalet is Wednesday. Vav is Friday. The first day of Rosh Hashanah cannot be on Sunday, cannot be on Wednesday, cannot be on Friday. Rosh Hashanah can only fall on one of the other 4 days of the week. Based on that cheshbon, I mean, to demonstrate it would be complicated, you need a PowerPoint or something, but based on that cheshbon, that Rosh Hashanah cannot be in one of those 3 days, the 10th of Teves can never be on a Shabbos. But Rav David Avudraham says, if theoretically it would fall on Shabbos, you would fast even on Shabbos. The 10th of Teves you would fast even on Shabbos. The only thing is, it can't fall on Shabbos, so this is what you would call an untestable proposition. But in the time when we would go back to the old calendar, that the witnesses, in other words, the rule of Lo Adu Rosh only applies when we're working with a predetermined calendar. When you go back to the old system, that when witnesses come and they see the new moon, we make it Rosh Hashanah, then Rosh Hashanah could be on any of those days, and Asara B'Teves could be any of those days. So theoretically, if that would happen, and we don't yet have the Beis HaMikdash, we would actually fast even on Shabbos. Now, although, as I say, there is no proof to the Avudraham, there's partial proof. Because the same way that we normally don't fast on Shabbos, we also don't fast on Erev Shabbos. Because we don't want to enter Shabbos in a state of hunger or discomfort. Now, if Asara B'Teves falls out on Friday, which it can, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, there actually is a Friday fast. We fast until Shabbos, which is very unusual because normally if Tainus Esther falls out on Friday, whatever it is, you push it back to Thursday. So we do see Asara B'Teves has an unusual power to override Friday. Says the Avudraham, it would even override Shabbos. Now, this is a big problem. I mean, Asara B'Teves at most was the first step in a series of events that culminated in the Churban Beis HaMikdash. But even the 9th of Av, where the Beis HaMikdash was actually destroyed, we don't fast on Shabbos. So why are you elevating the mourning, the Avelus, of Asara B'Teves to make it superior to the 9th of Av? Right? I mean, if you're going to tell me a general rule that the Churban Beis HaMikdash is so devastating that we even fast on Shabbos, okay, if that would be the rule, I would understand that. But if that would be the case, if I had to pick, if I was told only one of these fast days will be important enough to override Shabbos, I would have picked the 9th of Av. That's the day of the Churban itself. And yet, the 9th of Av does not override Shabbos. The only one that overrides Shabbos theoretically would be the 10th of Teves. Right? It's really a Pella. But part of the idea is some want to say, well, the 9th of Av is a 24-hour fast. So if we're going to pick something to override Shabbos, we only want to pick something that wouldn't deprive you of Oneg Shabbos legamre. See, if we were to say that Tisha B'Av overrides Shabbos, that means we would have a Shabbos with no physical enjoyment at all. That would be a total loss of Shabbos. Masha Ein Kain, by picking the 10th of Teves, L'chol HaPachas, Friday night, you could still have a meal and make Kiddush and Oneg Shabbos. So it's a question, it's kind of a practical issue, that Chazal didn't want to be Koveya, that a tainus would legamri, except for Yom Kippur, legamri take away Shabbos, so they did Asar B'Teves, which is a day fast rather than a night fast. Okay, so that's what Asar B'Teves is about. Now, in reality, the Shulchan Aruch brings that there were tzaddikim who fasted 3 days in a row. The 8th of Teves, the 9th of Teves, and the 10th of Teves, meaning the 8th and the nights in between. So here's the question. And this is called a tainus for tzaddikim, meaning most people didn't do it, don't do it, but there was the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th. And in fact, in the Slichos that we're going to read Tuesday, there will be a reference to the 3-day fast, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th. And each of these represent different tragedies that did not occur at the same time. They're not like 3 days in a row, they're different years. The tragedy of the 8th of Teves was the completion of the translation of the Torah into Greek. Now this occurred during the second Beis HaMikdash. Talmai was a successor of Alexander, wanted to have this great library like the Library of Congress or Hebrew University National Library, in which he wanted to have every book of the ancient world. And he commissioned 70 elders, Jewish elders, to translate the Torah into Greek, which was the spoken language then. And he put them in different rooms to ensure they would not consult with each other. And really a miracle happened, that they came up with the exact translations, including deviations. There were certain things they deviated from because they didn't want to cause machlokas. So for example, Talmai's wife, Mrs. Talmai's name was whatever the Greek word is for rabbit. I think it's Bernice. I think Bernice is actually the name for rabbit. And when the Torah says, Arnarnevet, a rabbit is a treif animal, so in Greek that would read, the Bernice is repulsive. So that would have been a big insult to Bernice. So they changed the word rabbit to a different word, etc. Or the first 3 words of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. But if you translate it hyper-literally in that word sequence, it could mean Bereshis bara Elokim, the beginning created God. So they changed the word order to avoid that ambiguity. Instead of the beginning created God, they said Hashem in Greek, Hashem bara Bereshit, God created the beginning. They made certain changes, and miraculously, Hashem made everybody make the same change. And this was the famous Greek translation of the Torah that is called Targum HaShivim, or sometimes by the Greek name, the Septuagint, which literally just means the translation of the Torah by the 70 elders. And this was completed on the 8th of Teves. And Chazal regarded that as a tragedy for which some people fasted on the 8th of Teves, the anniversary of the translation of the Torah into Greek. Now you might say, what's the big tragedy? It's a translation. I mean, what did Chazal see this as such a negative thing? So there are a few different reasons why they saw it as negative. One reason is by translating the Torah into other languages, number one, you are missing by definition all of the nuances. Meaning a translation is by definition taking a position as to what a text means. I read something in the Hebrew and I can see 70 faces to the Torah. It's this, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. A translator is only giving you one derech, shutting out the richness of all the other mahalchim. That's problem number one. Problem number two, by making the Torah accessible to non-Jewish influence and interpretation, you're now creating greater possibilities for distortion and falsification. There was kind of an idea of let's keep the Torah within the Jewish people so that others will not be able to falsify or distort it by bringing in their ideas. And problem number three was Chazal were decrying the fact that the huge Jewish population in Alexandria, which was the Egyptian capital, were so assimilated and so illiterate that they would learn the Torah only from the translation and not from the original. And again, we know that is the case. The Jewish population of Alexandria during the Second Temple was rich, politically very influential, highly assimilated, and educated in the Hellenist culture, but not very educated in Judaism. It sounds, again, a lot like the United States or other Western countries and the like. So this is very relevant on Art Scroll. I mentioned this before. I don't want to be myric, because a lot of you may have heard it before. You know, when the first Art Scroll came out in like the 1970s, I remember this, Megillas Esther. So people were saying how great it was. It's so wonderful that we've made the words of the Bible accessible to people and they can read the different commentaries. So somebody said, well, remember when the Torah was translated into Greek, people were crying. And the way you have to look at it is there's a simultaneous joy and sadness at the same time. There is a joy that we have these translations, and there's a sadness that we need these translations. So it's not a contradiction, meaning we can be profoundly grateful that we have Art Scroll, Chumash, and Siddur, and now we have Shas, Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Medrash. The amount of Torah that Art Scroll has generated in the world, I know in Ohr Somayach, Art Scroll is a little bit of a dirty word, although I see we do have them on the shelves. We haven't taken them off the shelves because, you know, the yeshiva wants people to become self-sufficient. Okay, that's very good. But the amount of Torah that Art Scroll has brought to the world is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. There's like unbelievable. And that's only a cause for joy. The number of people that have joined Daf Yomi classes because of Art Scroll, like double, triple, quadruple, I mean, even higher multiples, because they have this easily accessible translation with commentary. So on one hand, we have to be very, very grateful both to Art Scroll and, of course, ultimately to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for making these tools available. On the other hand, we have to be a little sad that our illiteracy is so great that we need these tools. It's like crutches. If a person has 2 broken legs and is given a pair of crutches, they're very, very grateful that they have crutches. Without crutches, they wouldn't be able to move. But at the same time, they could be sad that they need crutches. It would have been better to walk on their legs. Right? So that's exactly right. So the tinus of the 8th day of Teves is an avelos on Jewish illiteracy and inability to go back to the original sources. That's the 8th of Teves. Now remember though, that's way after the 10th of Teves. The 10th of Teves goes back to the beginning of the siege against the first temple. That's the 10th of Teves. The 8th of Teves is hundreds of years later when the Targum of the 70 elders were completed during the second Beis HaMikdash.
That's the eighth, not the 10th.
That's the eighth. That's the eighth, right. I'm saying that the event of the 10th was hundreds of years before the event of the eighth. Now, what happens on the 9th of Teves? Again, not the same year, totally different time. So here, the Shulchan Aruch says one of the most strangest sentences in the whole Shulchan Aruch. It says, the 9th of Teves, lo nasnu bo chachamim tam. The sages did not give us a reason for the fast of the 9th of Teves. Right? Fast for no reason. A little bit of a strange thing. Why didn't they give you a reason? Or what is the reason? So some come up with all sorts of reasons, but then the question is, why don't you give that reason? I mean, in other words, some say this was when Ezra died. Now, Ezra was the great, great leader at the beginning of the Second Temple. And Chazal say Ezra was so great that had Moshe Rabbeinu not already received the Torah, Ezra would have been worthy to bring the Torah down to Am Yisrael. And therefore, the yahrzeit of Ezra HaSofer becomes a fast for the righteous. Of course, one might ask, well, so why don't you fast when Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar? The answer is, for the righteous people, that's also a fast, meaning people fasted on Zion Adar, people fasted the 9th of Teves. And the Slichos indeed takes the position that the tragedy of the 9th of Teves is the death of Ezra. But it's difficult, because if that's what it is, then say that. Well, it's mashma that the Chachamim are trying to hide something. The Chachamim didn't want to give a reason for it. If this is the reason, why not give the reason for it? So, there's actually a document, it's called a medrash, but I don't want to use the word medrash necessarily, because it doesn't come from Chazal. It's later, from the Middle Ages, and it's unknown authorship. But it is a story that a number of Rishonim bring. And this story blows your mind. And that is, yes, the 9th of Teves is a yahrzeit, but it's not the yahrzeit of Ezra HaSofer. It's the yahrzeit of a man called Shimon Kippah. Who is Shimon Kippah? So Shimon Kippah is better known by his English name, Simon Peter. Simon Peter was Yashka's Talmud Mufak. He was the Apostle Peter. His given name was Simon, and he became known as Peter. And the reason is because Yashka said to Simon, "You are my rock." And in Greek, Petra means rock. Simon Peter, and that's exactly the Aramaic. Shimon Kippah. Kippah is Aramaic for rock. Shimon Kippah is a literal translation of Simon Peter. And on the yahrzeit of the Apostle Peter, who, by the way, was the first pope, he certainly was Jewish, we mourn and we fast. Why on earth would we mourn and fast on the day that Peter happened to die? We're like, I mean, it was a Russia, whatever. So here's what the Medrash says. The Medrash has a story, an amazing story, that Peter, Shimon Kippah, was a frum Jew, a religious Jew, a tzaddik. And when Christianity began to be nispashet, so remember, the first Christians were all Jews. Yashka himself was a Jew, right? They were all Jews. And they were davening in our shuls. They would be the equivalent today, what you call Messianic Jews. Mm-hmm. They were in the shul, they wore tzitzis, they wore tefillin, they kept kosher. And the Sanhedrin saw a tremendous, tremendous danger in this. Because by having people who were believing in this new Messiah in our shuls, in our kehilos, then God forbid, they could be missionaries, just as is the case even today. They could be missionaries. They could take us away. So Peter, this is what the Medrash says, Peter volunteered for what you might call a spiritual suicide mission. Peter said, I know I will never be in the Jewish community again. I know I may lose my olam haba. but to save Klal Yisrael, I will make myself a leader of this new group of people, and I will pull them away from Judaism and make them a separate religion, so they're out of the shuls, they're out of the yeshivos, they're out of the Batei Medrash. And people will know that they have no shaykhs to Torah. And he just asked one request, that on the anniversary of my death, pray for me, remember me, so I should have a share in Olam Haba. Now, this is brought by some Rishonim. Other Rishonim say this is malarkey, meaning say there really is a whole machlokas. Some say chas v'shalom. Some commentaries say this is a sacrilegious story, and some say no, this is exactly the idea what happened. But now you understand why the 9th of Teves the sages didn't want to give the reason. Meaning, tzaddikim might know it a little bit, but we don't want to say we're celebrating or commemorating the death of Shimon Kippur. But according to Shimon Kippur, who was the first pope, according to this medrash, he remained frum all of his life privately. In private, wore tefillin, kept kosher, learned Torah. Publicly, he made Christianity a separate religion, and in that way, he pulled out the cancerous influences from the Batei Knesiot and the Yeshivot and the Beis Medrashes. Now, to add to this amazing story, he also composed a tefillah that he asked be recited in all shuls. And according to this source, he was the author of the beautiful prayer Nishmas Kol Chai that we recite on Shabbos. And in many Sfarim, Nishmas is a general prayer that you recite for brachos from Hashem and the like. And according to a tradition that is recorded in the Machzor Vitri, Shimon Kippur is the author of Nishmas.
What was the name of the document?
Machzor Vitri. Vitry is a city in France, but this is a Talmud of Rashi. Now, I do want to point out, to be accurate, the Machzor Vitri brings such a tradition and then says it's not true. So I don't want to tell you the Machzor Vitri says it's true, but he records that there was such a belief and such a tradition. Now, again, I don't want to be misquoted here. I'm not telling you that any of this is true. I mean, as I say, there are Rishonim that not only say it's untrue, but they're very angry, they're very upset that you would make up such an edifice glorifying an apostle who believed in Yashka. So there's a lot of controversy about this, but there are some sources that support this type of version. And this, I think, would explain the enigmatic lashon of the Shulchan Aruch. We fast on the 9th of Teves, but we don't want to give you the reason. We don't want to tell you exactly why, because this would be a reason that many Jews would not fully understand. And of course, even the Christians may be antagonistic, that we're glorifying Peter as someone who didn't believe in Christian beliefs and was trying to get Christianity away from Judaism because it was a negative and destructive influence. Right, so these are our 3 days, the 8th of Teves, the 9th of Teves, the 10th of Teves. Unless you're a great tzaddik, however, we only fast on the 10th of Teves. Be'ezras Hashem, may this 10th of Teves become a day of rejoicing even this year. If chas v'shalom not, may it be the last time that we have a fast on the 10th of Teves. So be well. Take care.